Hi there. When you think of Aries, what do you think of? A warrior? Maybe a pioneer? How about a lone wolf? Somebody who goes off by themselves? Or maybe self-reliance and self-determination? And how do you think about zodiac signs in general? Do you first think of a description of the personality, certain behavior? Like for Aries, we sometimes say pioneering starts more than they finish. Ideas like that? Or do you think of the zodiac signs as an archetypal story where Aries is the warrior, like a mythic character that lives through us? Another possibility is that fundamentally zodiac signs are a lens through which we see the world, or maybe some combination of these. So let's first take the point of view of the archetypal story and myth. And this is often how we think of zodiac signs. It's not what I'm going to suggest is the most important way to think of zodiac signs, but I want to start with an idea that I think is common. So let's get this idea of what Aries is as often described, as a mythic character that lives through us. Okay, so what is Aries? Aries, well, first of all, we think of it as a god rather than goddess. It's a fire sign, so-called masculine rather than feminine, so I'll refer to it as a god. So Aries has a sword in hand, looks at you fiercely and directly. Aries speaks directly, does not vacillate or waver. Those who are weak feel intimidated by his intense and uncompromising intensity. We can take this image even further and say that Aries is striking in red apparel, commands respect, but his lack of tact and his inclination to strike quickly without first fully hearing what you say, not only hurts the feelings of others, but turns almost any occasion into a competition. People find little comfort in his company, and he often walks alone. He seems also to prefer his own company best. So there's an image of this Aries character. To take it a step further, let's say that Aries meets life with vigor and spirit. Like the first rush of spring, he is full of new life and innocence, seeming to lack experience but compensating for this with courage and strength. This idea draws upon the idea that when the sun enters Aries, it's the first day of spring. So Aries is the pioneer treading where others fear to tread. One of his great weaknesses, though, is his inclination to not follow through and persist. He would rather be off on a new quest, a new vision, and a fresh start. For spring is his season, red is his color, and new beginnings are his passion. So the image is clear. We recognize it within ourselves. We recognize that some people are more filled with the spirit of Aries than other people. So that's an idea of what Aries is. Is it true? Does this 30-degree section of the sky that we call Aries really impart these qualities? Well, for myself, I have Aries rising. When I was first studying astrology, this really worked for me. It really resonated with something in me. I said, this works. This is amazing. I really wanted this to be true. It made so much sense, put my life into perspective. It seemed to be a language that spoke to my soul and the essence of what was going on. I recognized it. It felt right. But then my little paradise started to fall apart. As I counseled people, didn't always seem to work as well for other people. I remember I interviewed 3 people, these 3 in a row by coincidence. They had stelliums in Aries. Their sun was in Aries, one other inner planet, and at least one other planet. All 3 were shy and gentle. 2 of them seemed to lack confidence. I was able to make sense of one of them with other things in the chart. The other 2 just didn't really seem to work. I didn't know if it was because I was a beginner in astrology. I didn't really get it. But I continued with it, and I decided that even though the Aries worked so well for me, I couldn't really rely on it. This image didn't seem to work consistently. And now, more recently, with rigorous research that I will present here with what we call extreme case sampling, which simply means we take people with the most Aries. If you have 4 or 5 planets in Aries, you must exhibit the qualities of Aries. And it confirms what I noticed when I was doing these interviews, thousands of interviews in the 1970s, that Aries is always self-reliant. That seems to be the issue. It's very often a lone wolf. They go off by themselves, do their own thing, antisocial or do unusual things, sometimes outside the scope of what is expected to be normal. And sometimes they're pioneers and warriors. So I'm making a strong statement here. I'm saying that Aries is not always a pioneer and a warrior, and it's not only because there are other things in the chart. It's really not the fundamental quality of Aries. And also, just another little observation, this association of Aries with spring, keep in mind it's true for only half the world. So what happens in the southern hemisphere? Now this is not such a big problem for me because I have not found that this innocent, powerful directness, all these images of spring with Aries didn't really work in these thousands of interviews that I did. I couldn't make sense of it. So either I'm not seeing things very clearly or it's just not true. And I've concluded that there is an element of truth to this idea of pioneer, but that's more of and warrior, but it's more of a symptom. And furthermore, I've come up with an idea that what zodiac signs are about is they're not really directly about our personality, our behavior, or even the archetypes. I think zodiac signs are about, as I have on the left side, a relationship to an existential fact. There's some fundamental fact in the universe, and we see the world through the lens with an emphasis on that fact. And in the case of Aries, that fact is that we have to depend on ourselves to ultimately decide things. I'll talk more about that in the next slide. And then from this existential fact and how we relate to it, the myth and the stories of our lives begin, and then we get personality and behavior. So, on the right side, there is an energy process behind the archetypes. This is one of the radical ideas that I'm suggesting, and that this energy process, you can look at it as a way of relating to the world. And number 3, I think that in most astrology we try to extract more information than is possible from zodiac signs. You just cannot be so sure about all these behaviors and different characteristics that we think the zodiac sign will have. What we can be sure about Aries is that underneath everything, deep within the person, this is what's happening. Self-reliance. The existential fact is this, that ultimately each one of us must decide for ourselves what to believe in and what direction to take in life. Nobody can decide for us. You know, you might have great teachers, great guides, but ultimately each one of us is going to have to decide for ourselves what's true and what we want to do and what direction we want to pursue. And this fact is what pervades and colors the entire life of the person who has a stellium. Stellium means a lot of planets in Aries. So a person with a lot of planets in Aries is always coming back to this existential fact. And what does this result in? An emphasis on self-reliance and self-determination, going their own way, and trying to find out what's authentic and what is real, and trying to be honest. They're trying to find their own voice. They don't want to be hypocrites, and they trust more in themselves than they do in other people. That's what I think Aries is about. Now, what kind of behaviors do you get from that? Very often they don't listen very well to others. They can feel alienated from other people, especially large groups, because they're trying to come back to themselves. They often have an immediate distaste for what most people are doing, for what the masses are doing. They don't want to be one of the sheep or, quote, groupthink. They're trying to find their own voice. Now this is interesting and often overlooked. They often sympathize with people who are outcasts. We sometimes think of Aries as not being very compassionate, being a fire sign all about themselves. They resonate with people who are out on their own, because they're out on their own, even when they're successful. They're always trying to come back to what they think is is real, and they don't want to sell out, you might say. They're also good at solo performances. The fact that they're solo performers can be overlooked. You just take it for granted. They're trying to find their own voice, so focus on what they want to say. And they can be pioneers. And socially unacceptable and extreme behavior is common. They often, sometimes, well, not often, but you'll frequently see them become obsessed with some personal interest. And they have in bold to often do what others are afraid or unwilling to do. Now, these are all manifestations or symptoms of the fact that someone is acutely aware, not even just verbally or consciously, but their whole life is colored by this awareness that they're going to have to make up their own mind in life. They can't just depend on other people. That's what Aries is about. That's the consistent thing. It has a Saturnian quality to it. Simple. What's the real truth? And the Mars is the courage to be authentic, which takes more courage than to be strong in the outer world, is to be honest with yourself. That's what I'm proposing. Now, notice that every zodiac sign has its positives and negatives, and one of the negatives of Aries is sometimes they don't listen very well because they're trying to figure it out for themselves. And if you're in a situation where Aries, I'm going to call it Aries, meaning a person with a lot of planets in Aries, where they don't seem to be listening, here's a little trick to help you communicate better. If the Aries feels that you have integrity and honesty with yourself, that you're speaking plainly and directly, and you've sorted out things, they're more likely to listen to you. So if they sense an Aries quality in you, they're going to listen better. If they feel like you're a little bit weak, wishy-washy, they're not going to listen. So a little trick there for helping to improve communication. Okay, so I've told you what my idea is, told you some of my personal experiences, and now we're going to see what the research shows us when we take people with extreme Aries. And I have a little formula here for how we determined what an extreme Aries is. The formula doesn't matter that much. If you have 4 or 5 planets in Aries, you're obviously strong Aries. And the name of the game here is we have to respond to the data. It's like a little game, right? These people must exhibit strong Aries traits. No excuses. They've got to have it. This is how we test our idea. And we have 8 people who in the database within the Series 2.0 software score extremely high. And here they are. I'll read their names quickly and then we'll see if it's really true. Are they warriors? Are they pioneers? We're going to play this little game where we're going to see if we can find something that they have in common. Okay, so it's Henry Landru. Not pleasant to think about, but he's a serial killer, or was a serial killer, I should say. And although it's unpleasant to think about, imagine if we could understand what drives a person to be so evil and so destructive. Might give us a way to help fix these problems in the future. Prince Leopold, royalty. David Steele, British politician. Brian Shaw, a basketball player. Dave Baldwin, a baseball player, who has a very interesting life after baseball, becomes a scientist, a poet, and a painter. Ford Madox Brown, a painter. Leon Gambetta, a French lawyer and politician. Ferdinand Cheval, a postman. He delivers mail and has this unusual hobby, I guess you could call it, almost a personal obsession, where he builds a palace in his spare time. So when he's not out delivering mail in his 9-to-5 job, his regular job, he has this passion, and he builds a palace. So, very interesting character. Now, are they pioneers? Are they warriors? Are they self-reliant? We're going to play this little game, and the rules of the game are, let's see what the data tells us. We can't avoid any of the data. We can't say, this isn't working, and just forget about it. We're going to try to match the theory to the data. So let's look at it. Here's Henry Landru. As you can see, he's got Mercury, Venus, Neptune, Sun, Moon, and Jupiter all in Aries in the 12th house. Huge Aries. Is he a warrior? Is he a pioneer? Is he self-reliant? Well, one thing we know is he's really evil. He gets involved with women, kills them, takes their money. the story I read in the articles about him online is that he got swindled by a large amount of money from somebody he was working for. He's decided he would start swindling other people. Evidently made him furious. And he started adopting the same behavior, and he becomes more and more evil and merciless to the point where he starts being a murderer. Now, one thing that occurred to me is that if Aries goes off by itself and won't listen to other people, maybe Aries is more inclined to this kind of evil behavior than other signs. Well, so I ran it through the software, compared murderers. We have a database of murderers from the Cochrane database included in the software, compared it to other professional groups. That's not true. But what you do notice is that the kind of evil activity in this case is a solo activity by themselves. Henry Landru is not part of a mob scene or a group effort. He's off by himself secretively doing it. It reminded me of Jeffrey Dahmer, who also secretly murdered people. And interestingly, Dahmer has Moon and Mars and Aries. So some of that's going off on your own. Usually it's constructive and positive. In this case, it's just downright evil. And in the case of Landru, we do see the traditional ideas of Aries with the sharpness, the violence, but we're not going to see that with everybody. So what is it about Landru that's Aries? Just the fact that he goes off on his own in a socially unacceptable way, and in his case, ethically, morally, in every way, not acceptable. Now, let's look at Prince Leopold. Here's some information about him, just to get an idea. He had hemophilia, died at a young age 30. He was intellectual, most intelligent of the 4 sons of Queen Victoria. Teachers noticed this. He was president of the chess club. He was active in the military as much as possible, despite his illness. He was a Freemason. Now notice that Freemason is a group activity. Aries is not completely antisocial. They just want to be authentic, and often their social activities are based around some purpose or something that's personally important. And other information about him. He did get managed to get married despite his illness. And he was happily married for a short time, had 2 children. Now here we see some of the Aries qualities. His mother tried to control him, and he fought with her to be more independent. So in a book review about Prince Leopold, here's a quote from Amazon.com. He seems to have been the most popular member within the royal family, although not with his mother. She was notorious for trying to keep her children on a leash long into adulthood. Leopold appears to have overcome these obstacles. In his short life, he accomplished a great deal. He was the first of the royal family to attend Oxford. He was on the board of a great many charities and managed to travel. So there it is. Self-reliance, self-determination. I'm going to have to figure out things for myself. I can't just be dominated by somebody else. And also note, in my conclusions here, he was actually a shy person. He was not loud and aggressive. He just wanted to follow his own life. He did it, became independent of his mother's control. So this idea that Aries is a warrior, ruled by Mars and likes to fight, I don't think is true. What Aries wants to do is be themselves. Just be honest and follow what's in their heart and in their minds to do. So I think Prince Leopold is a success story. He followed his own wits and managed to live as fulfilling a life as he could, despite his illness and the limitations that he faced. Now, David Steele, this is interesting. British politician. He exhibits very few of the characteristics of Aries. These are the kind of people that when I was studying astrology in the 70s, honestly, it was rather depressing. I'd find this Aries really works, and then I hit somebody like David Steele. Well, let's look at his chart. He's got Moon, Saturn, Sun, conjunct the midheaven in Aries, Venus, Mercury, also in Aries in the 9th and 10th houses. Well, he rises to the top of the government. Here's some information about him. He had a shared leadership position with a fellow named David Owen for a while. And here's a quote from Wikipedia. The relationship was mercilessly satirized by Spitting Image, evidently a magazine or newspaper, which portrayed Steele as a squeaky-voiced midget literally in the pocket of Owen. This is not what we expect of Aries. He was seen as overwhelmed by his partner in politics, David Owen. So what is that all about? So David Steele has this Sun, Moon, Saturn, Midheaven conjunction. Oh, I say 2.5. It's actually within about 4.5 degrees. Oops, I don't want to click there. Sorry. I wanted to go back here. The Sun, Saturn, Midheavens all within about 2 degrees. You see that striving to the top in the career. Well, why is he not more of an Aries character, a dynamic leader? He's a good negotiator. Another example is a colleague of his, Cyril Smith, was found to have molested young boys. And you might think that Aries would stand up and say, oh my God, this, make a strong statement. But David Steele was criticized for not being direct about it, being evasive, not taking full responsibility, as politicians often do. So he's a good negotiator. He's a good politician. He's not known to be a striking, powerful individualist, as we might think of Aries. So we see that a lot of the characteristics that we often expect of Aries are simply not true. Now, one of you may do some more research and see if you can find it. All I'm saying is I'm not able to find it. I just don't see it. So my bottom paragraph here is at best we could say that Steele is self-reliant and self-made man. The biographical information I read indicates that he, from a fairly young age, once he was in college, he had this idea that there are certain things that are not quite right in the domestic policy and the foreign policy of England. He wanted to make his contribution. He had a clear idea about it. He took a stand against apartheid when it wasn't so popular to do it. Here again we see the identification with people that are oppressed and abused. He's a self-made man. I think that's about all we can really see is the self-reliance and self-determination. And a lot of the symptoms we expect of a sign don't always happen. That's what I'm putting out there. It may be uncomfortable. We might not like this idea. What? You're telling me this doesn't really work? I'm just sharing with you what the data seems to say. And Brian Shaw, the basketball player, is another example of a self-made person. Starts in a troubled neighborhood. Through self-reliance, self-determination, he makes his way. He succeeds with it. Let me just adjust something here. There we go. So, and his colleagues, his fellow players love him. Kobe Bryant, another fellow basketball player, well-known, excellent basketball player. When there was going to be a new coach for the team, the Lakers, and he wanted Brian Shaw. He would have loved for Brian Shaw to be the coach. People just love him. He would break up fights, strong integrity, very intelligent, great interpersonal skills. It's the self-made man, the self-determination. Rather than being arrogant or pushing a point of view, he's actually a good negotiator. So self-reliance, again, and the self-made person, the self-determination, seem to be the only things that consistently really work here. And if you think that Aries is going to always be the person who starts the fight, who has a quick temper, who's quick to respond and say things they don't want to say, it just doesn't always happen. Shaw is famous for being the person who is quick to respond. He's the person who jumps in and says this isn't right. It's that integrity, that consistency, that strong center. Another Aries success story. Now Dave Baldwin also exhibits the qualities of following one's own path. He has a really wild story to his life. He retires from baseball, then goes on and gets a PhD in genetics and an MS in systems engineering. at the University of Arizona. This is wild. Imagine you're a baseball player, you're now an adult, you retire, and you go and you get a PhD in genetics. As if that's not enough, you go on and get a master's degree in systems engineering. He just follows his own eccentric, unique path. This is the heart of Aries. This is extreme Aries. Not necessarily the diversity, but that self-willed, independent action that doesn't follow what other people do. Extreme Aries personality, not as a warrior, not as an aggressive person, not as a person who starts a lot of things, doesn't finish them, etc., but just following his own determination. It's the best of Aries, and he becomes a poet and a painter. Very, very interesting fellow. So that's the Aries storyline, is self-determination and self-direction. Okay, so next person is Ford Maddox Brown, and again we see the Aries qualities. If you're expecting extreme innovation or pioneering or aggression, it's not there. But is he extremely self-reliant, going his own way? Yes. Consider a point where he's not selling his paintings and he develops a plan to emigrate to India. The willingness to go off on your own, to find your own way, to do what's in your heart to do. Also, we see the theme of the compassion with the disenfranchised. He opens up a soup kitchen. One of his greatest paintings work is about how people become disenfranchised or not fully supported within the system. So again, the themes of self-reliance, self-determination are there. Many of the behaviors, the images that we expect of Aries are not there. This is just what I'm getting out of the data by forcing myself to look at which people have the strong Aries. And Leon Gambetta, French statesman, he does exhibit some of the expected qualities of Aries. He's vigorous, he's energetic, he's dynamic, he's got this forcefulness. He also exhibits some of the lone wolf characteristics. He goes off by himself. He exiles himself when he's just disgusted with what the other people in politics are doing. Aries will often do this. They just leave, gone. They just want to be honest, be real. If they have to fight, they'll fight. But fighting sometimes just gets you embroiled in a lot of difficulty. And they often just take off by themselves. So he exhibits the Aries qualities of self-determination, self-reliance, and going off by oneself. Ferdinand Chauvel, he is not as far as I could tell from reading about him, a dynamic or forceful or aggressive or individualistic person. He just quietly, by himself, creates a palace in his spare time. He delivers mail for 33 years, and what do you do when you're not, if you have a regular job? Do you watch some games or some TV or have some other hobbies? Well, he devotes himself to building this palace. He has this dream, he does it. And the interesting thing about Chauvel, in contrast to our baseball player, who is so diverse and eclectic and a polymath who's able to do so many different things, he dedicates himself to one project. So the idea that Aries is going to start a lot of things and not finish them, we look at Chauvel's chart with Sun in the first house in Aries, with Aries rising, and 3 other planets in Aries, including 2 inner planets. Mars is the beginning of Aries. He's a quiet fellow, not intense in any way, just goes off on his own unique and unusual path. And this is the classic Aries behavior to me. Self-reliance, self-determination to go their own way without necessarily having all these Mars qualities of being, you might say, muscular or aggressive and so on. So that's it. Conclusion from the study, self-reliance and self-determination seems to be the consistent theme. It's the best we can do, I think. You're faced with people like David Steele, where really, honestly, if we look at what's really going on here, it's, I think, a little difficult to figure out what it is. That's Aries, and I think that self-reliance and self-determination um, is about the only thing we could say is consistent with all of them, where we could look at the chart, say something, and then meet the person and find that it's true. And again, tropical signs are limited in what they can tell us about a person. I do believe they're important, especially in relationships with other people. But figuring out exactly what the person does with it, very difficult to determine. Now, I'm just going to mention this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But before I had done this study, I had done the study with an earlier version of the Series software, Series 1.3, which doesn't have as much data. 1.3 doesn't have the full Astro Databank database. And the top people from my earlier study, there were 7 others with scores of 16 and 17, not as strong in Aries, not as powerful in Aries as I was able to find with the database. But these people also have strong, very strong Aries. And I had done the study, and again it confirmed the theme. So additional people with a lot of Aries in their chart, very individualistic, very independent, very self-determined, but not always warriors, not always clearly pioneers. And we see the various symptoms. Here's Emile Zola. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just another stellium in Aries here, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Mars, Pluto. Didn't score quite as high because I used ruler of the ascendant, and Jupiter, the ruler, is not in Aries. But still, obviously, he's got 4 Sun and Moon and 2 inner planets in Aries. Naturalism, simplicity and directness of Aries. He also is a defender of the socially outcast and abused. He takes a stand that when others are unwilling to take a stand. For Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who is accused of crimes primarily because he's Jewish and people had bias against Jewish people at that time and place. Who stands up? Emile Zola, Aries. Very classic Aries behavior. What he says about his work, also an Aries theme. Not Aries the pioneer and warrior, but he says, I want to portray at the outset a century of liberty and truth, a family that cannot restrain itself in its rush to possess all the good things that process is making available. The newness. This is a strong Aries qualities of going out on your own, relying on yourself, and taking the risks that are involved. Swinburne, he's got the extreme behavior and not socially acceptable behavior. So again, going off on your own in eccentric or unusual or socially unacceptable ways. And he's an extreme of that. Helmut Kohl, head of the German government, he, like David Steele, is a unifier and a negotiator. He's not splitting things up and going off on a combative role. Again, demonstrating, like Brian Shaw, the basketball player, negotiating ability with Aries. Doesn't fit some of the stereotypes. But notice this. Here's a quote from this website. He was so obsessed by politics, it took absolute priority over his family and his wife. When the Unification Chancellor, as he was called, because he helped unify Germany, decided to, and unify Europe actually, decided to run again for office in 1998 in the general election, his wife only learned of his decision by watching the evening news. Can you imagine that? That is Aries. Doing what you think is important and following your own path. Okay, Jean Sablon. You see the Aries come through with him in that more than any other of his contemporaries, Sablon was responsible for introducing jazz into French popular music. He's a singer, follows his own path, does his own thing. He's very successful. But again, the self-determination and self-reliance, he does not have many of the Mars qualities of being aggressive and so on, following his own path. Robert Carlyle, the actor, authenticity of his roles, and again we see the identification with outcasts and individualists, an Aries trait that's often overlooked, his sincere and intense acting. This is why he's Aries, because of his honesty, his integrity, his trying to get to those people who are being abused by the system, who are individualists and outside the normal frame of reference. And he really goes to extremes with this. Gay lover of a clergyman, for example, in 1994. These are things that happen, but often get overlooked by people who are afraid and unwilling to face these facts. And Carlyle is not afraid. Eileen Heckart, an actress, again, from what I could find out about her, some of the traditional ideas about what Aries would be in terms of being aggressive and so on don't seem to be true, but she's the self-made person. Works her way up, follows her own vision, follows her own way. So self-reliance and self-determination appear to work. The other traits sometimes work, sometimes do not. And King Fuad is a very dysfunctional person, very bossy, has a lot of the negative traits that can happen with Aries that we expect. So he does fit some of the ideas of Aries as being combative and arrogant, very, very true. So sometimes these classic negative traits that we would expect from Aries do happen, sometimes they don't. And here's a question. If Aries is about being honest with yourself, how can you end up with somebody like Fuad, who's not honest and is abrasive and arrogant? And I think it's psychological dysfunction. Something happens in his early childhood, maybe physiologically for whatever reason. He's trying to be honest and get to the bottom of things, but doesn't quite get there. But you see the self-reliance, the not listening to others, and so on. Okay, so there's a failure. We have success stories, our baseball player, our basketball player, etc., success stories, and we have failures, from extremely evil, such as the murderer, Landru, and the King Fuad, who is not a pleasant person, and in many ways not a constructive person. Okay, and I want to mention here, last slide, these were in the Series 2.0, these are the 8 people who scored very high that I reviewed. There were also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 others who scored very high, and I got some biographical information, but not enough to be clear about them. So just, to share the details, you might say honesty and academic information. These were the other people who scored 22 or higher that I did not include, and then there were others that I couldn't find any biography at all. So that's it. Bottom line conclusion of this is that I do think Aries is consistently self-reliant. It's built on this fundamental fact that we must decide for ourselves, and a lot of the things we expect in terms of behavior from what is often said about Aries, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. So there you go, my friends. I hope you got something out of that and enjoyed that. Take care. God bless. Namaste.